And a warm after dinner leadership welcome to Amrit Dhaliwal, who is the CEO and founder of Walfinch. Welcome, Amrit.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure. We have this virtual dinner table around which we're sitting, and I love to find out what food can you imagine on this table that would remind you of your childhood?
So I grew up in an immigrant household, and
Uh-huh.
the food, the dinner was always Indian food. It was chapatis, and there'd be one or two vegetable dishes and one or
Yeah.
two maybe chicken or something. And if it was a real party, it might be some red meat. So some Indian curries basically is kind of what would take me back to my childhood for sure.
Oh, was there a particular, is there one that you go to now that always reminds you of your parents or those that were caring for you at that time?
Yes, it's a wonderful question actually, and it gives you a warm sort of nostalgic feeling inside already just thinking about it. But there's this yeah, keema, which is like a minced meat, which
Yeah,
my mother used to make, and it was my favorite growing up. But yeah,
yeah.
simple, but it
That's
was very
right. It typically is. Every
yeah.
time I ask that question, it is usually very simple dishes, and that's great. And maybe whilst we're there, because I can maybe see in your eyes some things lighting up here. We're going to talk about leadership and your lessons in a moment. What have you learned from your home about leadership? If you can go back to those early years, those teenage years, what were you noticing in that time?
I mean, I had a very some practical lessons actually because my parents had businesses. They went through, went from factory work all the way to, being retired at 50. And what was really interesting for me was watching them in their place of business. But I was also involved in that, go after school, maybe take care of the shops when they were away. But I remember I was about 18 years old, and I remember something that my father said. We were moving house, and I was helping him unpack and saying, "Well, okay, his paperwork he thinks is very organized. I may have different opinions." And we're sort of unpacking. I was like, "Well, Dad, this is junk, of course, and it's just old pay slips." And it was from when he used to work at I think it was like a Mars factory,
Yep.
and he said, "No, no, I need to keep that." And I was like, "Why on earth do you need to keep this?" And he said to me, "There's this wonderful word in Punjabi, and essentially what it translates as is understanding your. It's one word, but it translates as knowing where you came from." And
Yes.
and he said this is a reminder of that. And actually, and what he said to me at that point was, when you go out in the world of industry, know that everybody's on an equal footing, whether it's a cleaner or the CEO. Treat
Hmm.
everybody with respect, because actually you just don't know when you might be one or the other of those, and you might go from one to the other. And I thought it was a very humbling moment and a very humbling lesson that he taught.
Brilliant. I love that. What's the word? I won't
The,
recognize it. I'm just interested to hear what it is.
the word is okad.
Okay,
So
great.
yeah, you can chat GPT
Don't
that.
ask me to spell it, but I love the sound of that, and I love the sentiment of it. Actually, the meaning is rich, isn't it? And I totally concur. Great wisdom from your father there. Thanks, Samri. I appreciate you sharing that. And for those that don't know what Walfinch is, could you give us a little snapshot into the nature of the business that you're running?
Yeah, Walfinch is a home care business, so we provide care for older people in their own homes. And what I've done is I've scaled Walfinch through the power of franchising. And
Yeah.
actually, I was talking about this earlier today with my team. That what we are not is just a care business. We are really a movement within the care sector. What we talk about is time to thrive. We talk about aging not being your final chapter but the beginning of the next chapter, and really that is the whole sentiment of it. I sort of look at it as a wellness brand for older people that we have the pleasure of franchising.
Yeah. Great. Well, I love that, and certainly in the things that I've been learning about you, I love this alternative view. You're bringing in a fresh perspective into the way that you're looking at business, and that's a great example of it. I'd love to dip in now to these. lessons that you've learned or wish that you'd learned earlier? Actually, maybe what 3 lessons do you wish you'd learned earlier?
I think there's lots of lessons actually, but if I were to go through my top three, I think number one is getting the right people around you. I was reading
Hmm.
this great article in the business section in Sunday Times yesterday, and it was about the golden cage and talking about founders and entrepreneurs that get stuck in a golden cage, and it was referring to this gentleman that had £100 million hotel business, but he was stuck. He couldn't sell to private equity because then he'd be sold with it and he'd have this long kind of earn out. He couldn't really take the time out because he was really stuck in the operations because he didn't have a professional exec team. And so I think having the right people around you from early doors, from the bit where you can't really afford it, I think
Yeah.
is super, super key. Understanding number two is understanding how money works and understanding the difference between cash flow and profit, and really understanding, well, okay, well, how do I squeeze the value of a pound? And one of the things I've got quite sort of good at over the years is saying, well, oh, we want a financial director, but actually, well, can we really afford that salary? Maybe not right now. So what could we do to make that work? And
Yeah.
really understand the creative angle around saying, if I want X, or I want to do this marketing strategy or whatever it might be, how can I do it that won't hurt me, but really because I understand the flow of money.
Yeah.
And then number three, I suppose I did a lot of this growing up, but I could have done more of this. And I think the using all of the facilities around me to learn from. So whether that is in today's money, that's podcasts are great. I mean, they weren't really around when I was 18. So I think podcasts, books. I remember, the sort of similar thing was sort of having business CDs back then.
Yes. Yeah.
um,
Absolutely.
all of a sudden, I feel very old. Remembering my Paul McKenna CD that I used to listen to at university. But and YouTube was around, of course. But actually, I think there's this richness of information that's there. But I started getting mentors and guides for my journey. But I probably started that later in the journey than I probably should have. And I think if I think about Walfinch, I started the business with a business coach that has 35 years of experience within the franchise sector, which
Yeah.
means I cut some corners, maybe not all of them, but I did certainly cut some corners.
Great. Great. Those are excellent. Let me play those back to you. So we've got this idea of getting the right people around you actually early. And I love that phrase. You probably saw me smile. Is like, even if you're not sure if you can afford them, it's like, second, how understanding the way money works, the flow of money, and making sure that to really understand that to be able to get the different angles, creative angles, and how you do your business. And then lastly, using all the resources, the facilities around you as part of that learning. You've mentioned towards the end mentors, guides, and my sense is there's a bit of that human in-person type conversation, and then you've got the things like people you may
Yeah,
not know through a podcast or a YouTube video, but there can still be a great resource to you if you draw upon them.
yeah.
Those
No.
are those are the main things.
Yeah, no, truly. And I think maybe number three is in many ways one of the most important if you're at the beginning of the journey,
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much free available content now that you could listen to hours and hours and hours of it and be, theoretically, well versed. And then you can then go off and find the right mentor and guide. And it doesn't have to cost you lots of money. I think if you ask people, they will support you. And I think actually the really interesting thing that I think about is thinking you probably want two people, one person that is really far ahead, that just wants to part with their war stories and no one wants to listen to them anymore, and that's great because you're there and you'll learn from it. But also the other person that is just two steps ahead. They're not like
Yeah.
a million miles ahead. They're just a couple of steps, so they can, their information is really recent. They get it. They know because they can literally remember. Last year I was in your pain. This is what I did.
Yes.
So
I
I
guess in the context of today, the technology of someone 30 years ahead of you, might be a completely different landscape in terms of how they might go about the business today, for example, than
Yeah.
what they might have had to have done 30 years ago. As an example,
Yes,
some of the
truly.
basic principles will be the same, but the reality of them, what's happening in the market, and how
Yeah.
things have shifted perhaps since that time could be useful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's stay there a little bit more. I mean, you mentioned this individual that you had early on in setting up Walfinch. What were the characteristics? How did you know that he was somebody you wanted to ally with and uh, help support you?
Yeah, hilariously, his name is Simon as well, actually.
Okay.
But I think there's a lot of people in this market, in this kind of consulting coaching market, that are, a little bit shit, to be honest, Simon.
Yeah.
I'm allowed to use that word. And I think there's a lot of people that actually you probably don't want to listen to, and you have to hone your sniff testing over time, and probably get burnt a couple of times along the way. From my perspective, I was a few businesses in by the time I'd started Walfinch, and I sort of think that I have honed in that skill of understanding, well, does this person actually know what they're talking about or not?
Yeah.
I think really kind of getting to the point of, can this person help move my needle? Because if they can't, if it's not going to change the number, forget about it. You
Yeah.
don't need the theory of it. So I sat down with this chap, and we had a coffee. And initially, I was just asking him lots of questions and just seeing where his answers were. Was he giving me lots of fluff, or was he actually getting to the brass tacks and really kind of getting
Yeah.
under the hood and saying, well, we do this and we do that, and here's the issue, and so on and so forth. And I thought it was really interesting. Like, listening to his answers, it was clear to me that he understood the heart of the issue. And I said, right, great. So we then, I bought a little bit, and I said, well,
Yeah.
okay, I'd like to just dip my toe in and see. And it really quickly became a much bigger relationship. And it's really intriguing. I mean, it doesn't always happen like that. I've
Uh-huh.
had other people that I've dipped my toe in, and they've just been accountability partners, and that's it. They've been
Yeah.
great for the 2 hours a month that I associate with them. But then there's others, much like this Simon, who really kind of is someone I speak to most days, actually.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've ever watched Billions, but
No,
um,
I've not. No, I've not seen that.
there's this character in there who's like a psychiatrist for all of the traders, and I often laugh with Simon that you're like her, right? Like, you sort of get your head straight and
Yes.
send them off again. I'm like, great, you need that, I think, in business often.
Well, that was going to be one of the questions that was forming. Actually, was what is that relationship? What value is that bringing that you're not able to perhaps do on your own? Like,
Yeah.
why bring this person in? What is it that he's adding?
I think one of the biggest things is honesty. And what I find as a founder, as a CEO, is that it's hard for people to tell me I smell.
Yeah.
And actually, I understand that. But I've always been a business owner. I've owned my own business since I was 22 years old.
Yeah.
So I worked for someone for 8 months, and the rest of it was all self-employed. And what I realized really early doors, and I grew up with parents who had their own businesses, so I've always been acutely aware that you have to allow people to speak to you freely, and it won't be like colleagues, and it won't be like your siblings, but you have to kind of get to the heart of it before someone tells you the honest truth. And so having someone like this around has meant that actually he'll tell me 6 months before the thing that everyone is thinking. And I'm like, great. So I can now fix that and do something about that, or before it actually happens. And I think having someone that isn't afraid to have the honest conversation is really important. So certainly there's that. The other part of it is is really the accountability partnership, saying, well, okay, as a founder, there's 100 things I could be spending my time doing, but actually maybe three of them will be the thing that will impact the bottom line, both for me and my franchisees. And so they are the three things I should be focusing on. But the other 97 might be way more fun and
Yeah.
might bring me personally more joy. But the greater good is in the three things that I don't necessarily want to do today. And having that kind of accountability partnership is certainly the thing that you kind of need to say, well, keep
Sounds
my
huge.
feet on the fire.
Yeah.
And the last thing I'd say is it's emotional. It's really lonely running your own business, actually. And having somebody that you can pick up the phone and just rant to sometimes. And he'll ask me the question, what do you want from me here? Do you want me to advise or do you want me to just, listen and coach,
Yeah.
And sometimes it'll be one or the other. And other times you just want to kind of lighten the load, but you can't speak like that to your team. You can't speak like that to your clients, and so on. I think the interesting thing about being a leader is that you have to do the opposite all the time. So if your team is down in the dumps, you need to be high energy and say, no, we can do this, and off we go. And if they are really high energy because they've hit the number, great, 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 you need to bring them down to earth and say, hold on a second, guys. Thank you. We've celebrated. Now the next quarter's here. So
Yeah.
it's actually quite emotional because you're constantly doing the opposite to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that, and I can resonate with some of those feelings that you're expressing there. Look, you've just put a little bit of rewind a couple of minutes back to your 22-year-old self. Did you say?
Yes.
And that's immediately intriguing for me. How what was going on that said? Well, I've heard a conversation you've had with somebody else to say that you realized you were unemployable.
Yeah.
Was the phrase that you used in that conversation, and I'd love to just understand what was going on for you as a 22-year-old deciding, actually, no, I'm going to come out of an employed role and go down a self-employed route, because many would argue that was quite a brave move at that age. Uh, could you just
Yeah.
share a little bit into what was going on for you there?
I think from my perspective, I just couldn't work for somebody. It just wasn't something that I was really willing to do. I mean, I did it as a tick box exercise, but I was just like, I'm not going to live my life like this. I just can't, live with someone
How
else.
did you know that, Amrit? Like, what was going? Was there
You
conflict, or
know,
was
I
it
felt like that.
internal? Was it internal
It was
stuff? What
always,
was
I've,
going on?
I've always
Right,
felt like that. My first business I started when I was 10 years old, actually, selling Ryan Giggs posters in the playground.
right.
And I had various other, ventures. I found myself in Budapest in my second year of university saying, I think the property market's hot here. I think I can get some student loans and buy a property. And luckily the market crashed before I'd parted with that money. But for me, I just never wanted a real job, as I used to call it. And
Yeah,
I couldn't think of anything worse than turning up to an office at 9 o'clock and then leaving that office at 5 o'clock and then turning up again the next day at 9 o'clock and then leaving at 5 o'clock. And then every 3 months, someone sits me in a room and says, good boy, bad boy. I just,
yeah,
it blew my mind that this is how people spend lives. And actually, my nephew, who is 23, just turned, has just gone into the world of work. And when he graduated, I just gave him a big hug and I just said, "I'm so sad for you." I'm just, I feel so, you've got all of this to look forward to, And I just thought, gosh, it's actually really hard work until you find your path and you understand, well, I've kissed some frogs, now I'm good at this thing. And that might be employment. It never
yes,
motivated me. And I because I just always sort of looked at everyone. I remember this line manager that used to sit next to me, a really nice guy, Patrick his name was, and he had a phenomenal amount of money, and he was only in his late 20s. And he said one day, and he'd say this to me loads, one day I'm going to open a restaurant. And I was like, Patrick, you've been earning like mid six figure numbers for years and you live on your own. I know you don't spend that much money. Why one day? And he's like, well, I've got this to do and I've got that to do, but one day I'm going to do it. And I just thought, God, I hope I don't turn out like that, because I'd rather earn half the money, but be able to turn up when I want. And yes, I have the flexibility of working 168 hours a week whenever I feel like, you know. So,
Yes,
but it's my choice,
absolutely.
right? Well, he builds himself, right?
Yeah, I mean I think that's the reality. Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a nice way of putting it. Is yeah, but you're doing it on your terms, I guess, and feeling like it's more of a choice than
Well, I'm
working.
building an asset,
Yeah,
right? It's my asset. I'm not building
yes,
someone else. And if tomorrow I think, screw this, I'm out, I'm able to sell that asset, and there's some value in
yeah,
that. It's what I say to my franchisees: you're building your own asset. Now, I've got a meeting with one of our franchisees, our early doors franchisees, tomorrow. He'll do best part of £2 million of revenue this year, and he's been a lawyer, he's been in finance, but he's never been able to drop his kids to school or walk his dog in the middle of the day. And now he'll earn, again, mid six-figure dividends, and be able to
yes,
walk his dogs, play with his kids, pick him up from school. Okay, I know which one I do. And yes, there's going to be a couple of years of beans on toast, and it's more stressful actually because you've got more to lose. But tomorrow he decides to sell, he could sell it for 4x the profitability, right? It's not
yeah.
bad.
Yeah, and I guess this taps in a little bit to your second point as well. Maybe we can go there for a moment. I mean, we've gone all sorts of other different places for a while, but talk to me about the where you would recommend someone to start to understand how money works. Maybe it's linked to the third point, of course, but how do you mention this as a lesson you wish you'd learned
Mm.
earlier? What it sounds like you had a good grasp of economics from a 10-year-old, I guess. What would you recommend for someone to understand the flow of money?
There's this lovely book which I haven't read for years, and I may just pick it up again. But it's called Profit First, and I don't know if you've come across it,
I
but
haven't. No, no.
it's a great book. I want to say it's by a chap called Mike Klaskowski, if I can't pronounce his surname properly,
Okay.
and it talks about having I think 5 different bank accounts essentially, and it's about taking your bit first and saying, well, okay, this is what I need, and then what is reverse engineering the P&L. And
Yeah.
I like it because it's a little bit out there, but also it talks about entrepreneurial poverty, which I'm sure most entrepreneurs, certainly small businesses, have encountered. And I think that is a really important piece to really kind of look at. If I've got £100 coming into the business, how does that flow? Is £5 coming to Amrit's fund money, £5 going to looking at some saving, £20 going to the tax, and so on, and
Yeah.
£20 going back into the business. I think understanding things like that would be really great. So it is unconventional. It isn't the way that the accountants look at it. But I think that's a great book. I think then also really understanding your own economics, and there was this very scary statistic that I heard recently of £27 a day of expenditure is £10,000 a year. And I was like, hold on a second. I spent £15 on a lunch the other day in passing, and about sort of a tenner on a couple of coffees throughout the day. And I thought, hold on.
Yeah.
And you just sort of think, well, okay, and what could you do with that if I was rather making my lunch from home, taking it into and putting that money into a sort of tracker fund and link that compound, and really sort of understanding simplicity of things like that,
Yeah.
and there's some great sort of literature out there. There's some great speakers out there that I think are worth listening to. So getting into podcasts, maybe picking up with financial advisors if they're ever doing a talk, or
Mhm.
and things like that, and saying, well, okay, the thing that my 23-year-old nephew has on his side is time. So if he were to put £100 away today and then say, well, let me put that in a tracker fund, it might increase by 5 or 10% a year, and I've got £100 going into it every month over 30 years, what does that number look like? And
Yeah.
maybe I increase that number a little bit every year, but £100 you probably won't note going. and but it will mean something quite meaningful later. So I really think just very practical things like that, because those practical things can change the way you live. And the thing I'm seeing more now is on the other end of it. They give you choice when you're older.
Yes. Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. That's really useful. And I one of the things that I would love to just explore is what made you go down the franchising route? What was it about that from an entrepreneur that was interesting to you?
Initially I thought it was a bit of a scam, and I thought, God, this franchising. Why am I giving someone money that I could just do it myself? And it was my now wife, my then girlfriend, that suggested home care to me in the first place. I was only about 25 years old at the time, and I had no idea what the hell it was, and she said, well, go and speak to these franchisors. And so I did a bit of research, and I went all around the country speaking to franchisors, met them, and so on. And really what struck me for this sector specifically was the red tape around it. And I thought, well, actually, I'd quite like someone holding my hand with that. And then when I got in, I thought it was a bit broken. It was a bit archaic, both franchising and home care, which is why I then built that business, sold it, started Walfinch, because I just kind of looked at it and I thought, is this the McDonald's service? Are people from random sectors falling into this and learning how to build and scale profitable businesses? Because again, I was 25 when I bought a franchise, and that was in 2012, and I sold it 4 or 5 years later, in 2018. And then I started Wolfinch in around then. And so my point really is that it's really kind of looking at that and saying there's tremendous power in franchising if you are backed by the right franchisor.
Yeah.
It can really cut out years of those early days and that pain.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So what is it that you used to value? What is something that you used to value that you no longer value as strongly?
In life or in business?
Let's keep it whatever you wish to go.
I think stuff. And you can put this in both categories. You sort of. I grew up as I said, an immigrant family, and so you don't have loads of stuff, right? And the other kids have stuff that you don't have, and as you get
Yeah.
older, that stuff gets more fancy. And so I remember, going through uni and thinking, well, okay, well, great. I was in my same grey tracksuit that I'd hit the gym in, and all of that sort of thing. And I left university. Everyone's in these shiny suits and their Rolexes and all of the cool stuff. And then a few years go past, and you're able to get some of that stuff, and it's like, well, this is amazing, and you have that day of euphoria. But then it's all a bit of a letdown after that, because you think, well, now I've got the responsibility of taking care of this stuff and insuring this stuff. And actually, I live in London, so I'm worried about someone, ripping my arm off for this stuff. And then you also realize that, does it matter? And then, after that, you have a couple of kids, which I've had, and well, my wife's had, and she did all the and you sort of really realize what is important in life, and
Hmm.
what I really think is important in life is relationships, and actually kind of going and reverse engineering that. It's lovely having the stuff and maybe some of the stuff, but really, if that is what your driver is, I think that's a problem. And for me, the driver is very much about where I spend my time, and being able to do 80% of the school pickups is really important to me, as
Yeah.
opposed to being able to do the school pickups in a new Porsche, which
Yes.
is very nice if that's what you're up to. But
Yeah.
you know, but if I had to pick one, if I couldn't
Yes.
do both, then I know which I'd pick.
You framed the first as a problem. Help me explore that a little bit more. I concur. I'd love to just get you thinking. Why is the stuff as the end game a problem in your eyes? What's the problem of that?
Yeah. Yes. So and that's well spotted on the wording there. I think the problem for me is that as an entrepreneur, if your focus is purely arbitrary on a number, then you will cap out because, okay, maybe that number is 200, 300, 500, £1 million. But once you've earned that, well, great, I've hit that number. And then your
Uh-huh.
business stagnates or fails because, well, I don't need any more. And, I'm going to keep it steady. But guess what? There is no steadiness in business. It's either up or down. There is no this. And if you're this, then that really means that you're down. So that's business. And in life, I think, and actually just finishing that point, in fact, I think the important thing in business is being able to solve a purpose. Now, I don't care if your business is paper clips, but if you are passionate about putting two pieces of paper together tightly and neatly, and you have a purpose in that, great. Focus on that, being the best at that, and that will focus on building the driver. And once you do that, the EBITDA will come. In your personal life, for me, the problem is that if your focus is always the stuff, it usually means that there's lots of other things missing, and those other things are meaningful relationships.
Uh-huh.
And you know, I remember when I was on the dating scene, I would really make a point of not doing the I'll buy you a drink or I'll take you out for dinner, because I was like, well, actually, no. In fact, I won't buy you a drink, and we definitely won't be going out for dinner. So let's figure out what we can do here. Also, because I couldn't afford to, right? Um,
Yes. Yeah.
which is also quite helpful for me to be so high with the integrity there. And so, whereas and then you sort of think, well, I go out with my wife a lot. And, that's one of the things I enjoy doing the most. And I'm sort of the view that I can kind of do two things really well. I can either be a family man and an entrepreneur really well, or a friend and an entrepreneur really well. I don't think I can do all three. So, my
Yeah.
friends have had to take a slight back seat at the moment. And so I really enjoy going out with my wife. Now, we go to all ends of the spectrum of restaurants, and we have an amazing time and spend lots of money, and we have an amazing time and spend no money.
Yeah.
The point is we're having an amazing time, and sometimes that's you know added to the fact that there is some really wonderful dishes coming out of the kitchen. But most of the time, frankly, if you don't have the relationship there, the stuff is irrelevant. If I'm at that dinner and we're arguing, but there's a Michelin star meal and
Yes.
£400 bottle of wine, it's irrelevant. I'd rather be at Flatiron for a £10 steak. And so it's kind of really understanding where the problem is, and I think the problem is relationships, and there is a lack of focus on that as a general community, and I see that with older people, and I see that with myself in many respects as well. And these are things that I really focus on and think about. Well, how are my relationships? Am I happy with where they are? Do I need to spend more time with certain people? Or should I have a conversation with them and say, hey, this is where my head's at? Because clarity is kindness.
Yeah. Wow, wonderful, and I agree with that a lot. And I think there's something I was speaking. I was with my brother, one of my brothers, at the weekend, and we grew up. We one of 11 children, so not an immigrant family, but we were in a large family, and so it
Wow.
was one of the things we were talking about is like the lack of stuff, and that was passed around like hand me downs.
Yeah.
I was boy number. We get this right, boy number 5, and so I inherited some clothes from my older siblings, etc.
Battered by the time it got to
Yeah,
you. Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, I've got a good story about some school trousers that ripped from knee to knee one day. They'd been through 5 of my siblings. But anyway, that was yeah. So I can relate to many of those things, and it was interesting. Also, this brother I was speaking to nearly died last year. So he had pancreatitis, acute pancreatitis, and in a hospital in Barcelona, and was very close to death. And we were talking about that over the weekend, was just some of the reflections on that. And he's used the same word, actually, stuff.
Yeah.
Like, doesn't doesn't appeal to me anymore. Like, why? There's so many other things that are so much more important than stuff when you're face to face with that. With your own mortality, I guess. And so often in life, it's those crisis moments that makes us think more deeply about those things.
Yeah.
And going to the funeral and that kind of stuff is a point of reflection, isn't it? So, yeah, um, wonderful. Well, the other thing that occurs to me, Amrit, is it feels a little bit like we've come almost full circle back to this knowing where you came from.
Yeah,
I,
that's
I
very
know
true.
I've asked you specifically about your parents and your family, but it feels like there's I may be jumping to conclusions, but there's some elements that feel deeply rooted in the lessons that you learned as a child, as a teenager, that feel to echo through your life. I hope I'm not misjudging that, but it feels like, yeah, there's some really resonant stuff to you as a child.
Yeah, I mean, I had a lovely childhood. I mean, it wasn't. I sort of compare my childhood to my wife's childhood, and hers was magical, and mine was great. And it was mine was just fine. But it was really it was maybe I kind of grew up too quickly as well with it. But what was
Okay.
really interesting were the things that you learn along the way and you see along the way, and yeah, I think they really impacted how I am as a human. I got my daughters a couple of cupcakes yesterday, and they had, they're only little, and they were like, oh, can I have a receipt? And so I got two receipts printed, gave one to each of them, and they were like, oh, well, it was £3. It doesn't really mean anything to them. And I was like, well, no, actually, it's £3.50 each, and then you got some taxes, and actually I've passed with £12.50. And I said, do you know how long it takes a care worker to to buy two of these cupcakes? And they were like, well, how long? And I was like, probably almost 2 hours, actually, when you take into account that they got to give the government some money and all
Yeah.
of that. But, certainly 1.5. And really just trying to kind of, I mean, it's really hard. It's an arbitrary thing for children, but trying to kind of pass a little bit of that on, because, if they want something, they ask, they invariably receive it. And I think part of the problem that I have now, and I think my generation of immigrants kids have, is that from our parents it was inbuilt. They couldn't afford it anyway, so, and they couldn't afford to part with that, and so lessons were learnt, and you learnt about how to kind of squeeze the pips out of everything, and the trousers that you had that were passed down and so on. And really, you really thought about that. I remember my school blazer. It was awful. Oh, it was awful. I had this blazer and we had to have an iron-on badge. But of course, my badge was a badge that had been through the wash from one of my older sisters, ripped off hers, and then pressed onto mine. It was bobbly and it was a mess. And you know, kids were like, "What the hell is it?" Theirs was pristine,
Yeah.
clean, pressed down. Mine for 5 years was just horrible. It would be pulled off to be put onto the next blazer, and but the point was that actually, so those lessons were inbuilt for me, but they're not for the next generation. And I think it's a really
Yeah.
important thing. It's something I think about a lot, to think, well, what I don't want to do is raise entitled children, because they only burden the system. They don't support it, don't help it. If hopefully they'll have some resources and so on. But what are they going to do with that? Is that going to go on the Ferrari fund, or are you going to go and try and help someone else and do something good?
Yeah. Well, that's a good place to leave the conversation, and I'd love to uh, find out, how do people get in contact with you, Amrit, if they want to explore this a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, so the wolfinchfranchising.com website, I'm pretty easy to get hold of on
Mm-hmm.
Instagram, Amrit Wolfinch, and LinkedIn, on basically all of it. I've got a Substack. I've got a YouTube channel, which is actually quite useful if there's interesting things that you're keen on in terms of how to build and scale businesses and franchising and home care. And it's called Amrit the Walking CEO. I also have my own podcast, which is called Walking with Walfinch, and a book that is out on Amazon called Time to Thrive: The Home Care Revolution, and all the proceeds go to the Care Workers Charity.
Amazing. Well, there's lots of avenues there. I hope people will take you up on that contact. One of the things that I've taken from today as a bit of a theme is the value of time and money, or money and time might be a better way to put that. Value of money and time, and recognizing that as a leader as being a critical thing. Amongst many other little pearls there that you've shared with us. Thank you so much, Amrit, and I wish you the very best of success. What's a takeaway for you from our conversation today?
Yeah, actually, it's just given me a moment to reflect on. So I do or historically, I've always done a kind of quarterly personal reflection on life and just am I on the right track and so on. And I probably haven't done that for about 6 months, I think.
Yeah.
And I think this has kind of given me a moment to just stop and think, am I doing the things that make my heart happy in life? And if I am, great. And if I'm not, how do I get my life back on that? And I think it's a really wonderful exercise for everyone to do. But yeah, and so this given me that moment to think, gosh, I'm still really enjoying it all.
Great. Thanks, Amrit. Wish you best in your business and in your family, and I hope you continue to see Walfinch grow in the way that you want to. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks for having me on.